The M60 weighed 23 pounds. Its barrel ran 22 inches. It fed 7.62 ammunition from a disintegrating belt. It fired near 550 rounds a minute. Yet the gun was presented as America's own. It was assembled from the weapons America had faced. Its feed came from the German Meter's G42, the wartime buzzsaw. Its action came from the German FG42, the paratrooper rifle. Two enemy guns met in one steel frame. The requirement was small. The result was vast. It armed 30 nations and served for 50 years. Built for the squad, it escaped the squad. It rode helicopter doorways. It walked jungle trails. It hung from a movie hero's arm. The gun inherited German engineering and paid for it in American compromise. Its red-hot barrel had no handle. That contradiction sat at the center of the weapon. America had won the war. America had the largest arms industry on Earth. And when America built its next machine gun, it reached back into the arsenal of the men it had beaten, took the best organs from two of their guns, and stitched them into one. It was neither a true copy nor a true original. A copy reproduces one weapon. An original owes nothing to any. The M60 did both, and neither. It occupied the space between the enemy's brilliance and America's own unmet need. The need was real. The United States finished the Second World War with rifles, carbines, and two machine guns that each did half a job. It had nothing that did the whole one. The Germans had shown what the whole job looked like. They had built a single weapon that could support a squad on the move and hold a line from a tripod. America wanted that weapon. America did not yet have it. So the question that runs under this entire story is simple, and it is not comfortable. How do you build a weapon of your own out of the guns your enemy built first? The answer took 12 years, 2 failed attempts, and a captured rifle sawn in half. It would travel from Aberdeen's proving grounds to Vietnam's paddies, from helicopter doorways to foreign armories, from movie screens to collectors' vaults. It would earn a nickname that was half insult and half love. And in the end, it would be replaced by yet another gun descended from the same German buzzsaw. This is the entire story of the machine gun America copied. Chapter 1. America had machine guns. None of them fit the squad. America ended the war with the best industrial base on Earth. It did not have one machine gun that fit the job a rifle squad actually needed. That sounds impossible. The United States had outproduced every enemy. Its factories had poured out rifles, aircraft, tanks, and ammunition in numbers no other nation could match. Yet the squad automatic weapon at the center of the American infantry formation was a design from the First World War, and it did only part of what it was asked to do. The weapon was the Browning automatic rifle. Soldiers called it the bar. It fired the full .30-06 cartridge, it was reliable, and men trusted it. But it fed from a box magazine of about 20 rounds. It had no quick-change barrel. When the barrel grew hot, the gunner could not swap it. He could only slow down or let the gun cool. That limitation defined its ceiling. A bar gunner could deliver bursts on the move, but he could not deliver sustained fire. 20 rounds ran out in seconds. Then came the pause to change a magazine, and in that pause, the fire stopped. For a weapon meant to pin an enemy in place, the pause was the enemy. The other end of the arsenal held the answer to sustained fire, and it created a new problem. That weapon was the Browning Meter's 1919, a belt-fed medium machine gun. It fed from long cloth or linked belts. It could fire and fire and fire. From a tripod, it could hold a line for as long as the ammunition and barrels held out. But the 1919 was heavy. The tripod-mounted versions were built to sit, not to move. Ordnance produced a lighter model, the Meter's 1919-6, meant to be carried and fired from a bipod. It reached about 32 pounds with its bipod and stock. A soldier could lift it. He could not maneuver with it the way an assaulting squad needed. So the American squad carried 2 answers to one question, and each answer was half wrong. The bar could move, but could not sustain. The 1919 could sustain, but could not move. Between them sat a gap, and the gap had a shape. The shape was a single weapon that could do both. The Germans had a name for that idea. They called it the Einheitsmaschinengewehr, the universal machine gun. One gun, one manual of arms, one supply of parts. On a bipod, it followed the riflemen forward and gave them automatic fire. On a tripod, it dropped into the sustained fire roll and held ground. Change the mount, change the job. The gun stayed the same. American doctrine had not caught up to that idea during the war. It arrived late, and it arrived the hard way, from the receiving end. Popular retellings sometimes frame the bar as a beloved war winner and stop there. That affection was real. Veterans loved the bar for what it did well. But love is not the same as sufficiency, and the record shows the deeper truth. The Army itself kept trying to replace the bar for decades because it knew what the weapon could not do. A gun men trust can still be a gun the doctrine has outgrown. The trade-off in the squad was written in weight and in seconds. The bar bought mobility by giving up the belt and the spare barrel. That saved pounds and cost sustained fire. The 1919 bought endurance by anchoring itself to a heavy mount. That held ground and cost the assault. Every advantage in that arsenal was paid for somewhere else, and the man who paid was the rifleman who needed both at once and got neither. That man is the reason this story exists. Picture the automatic rifleman in a hedgerow or on a ridgeline. He carries the heaviest weapon in his squad. He is asked to move with the assault and to pin the enemy down, and his gun can do one or the other. When the fire has to be constant, his 20-round magazine betrays him. When the squad has to rush, the belt-fed gun back at the tripod cannot come along. The concept that would close this gap already existed. It had already been built. And the Americans who needed it most had met it on the wrong end of a battlefield, where it did not look like a solution. It looked like a saw. Chapter 2. The buzzsaw on the far side of the beach. The gun that taught America what it lacked was the gun that had been killing Americans. It did not sound like a machine gun. It sounded like cloth tearing. That sound came from speed. The German Meter's G42 fired at roughly 1,200 rounds a minute. At that rate, the human ear could no longer separate one shot from the next. The reports fused into a single ripping note, and men who heard it never forgot it. Allied soldiers called the weapon Hitler's buzzsaw. They also called it Hitler's zipper. German troops had their own names: Hitlersage, Hitler's saw, Knochensage, the bone saw. The Soviets called it the linoleum ripper. The names all described the same thing: volume of fire so dense it changed the character of a firefight. A single Meter's G42 could dominate ground that would have taken several slower guns to cover. When it opened up on a beach or in a hedgerow, infantry did not hear individual bullets. They heard a wall. But the sound is the part everyone remembers, and the sound is not why the Meter's G42 mattered to American designers. What mattered was underneath. The Meter's G42 was cheap. It was fast to build. And it was general purpose in a way the American arsenal was not. Look at how it was made. The Meter's G42 was built from pressed and stamped sheet steel, spot-welded together, with as little precision machining as the design could manage. That construction cut the labor dramatically. The earlier German Meter's G34 took around 150 man-hours to produce. The Meter's G42 took about 75. It used roughly 27.5 kilograms of raw steel, where the older gun used 49. It cost about 250 Reichsmarks against the Meter's G34's 327. Those numbers are the real weapon. A gun that costs less and builds faster can be everywhere. Germany produced more than 400,000 Meter's G42s. The yearly figures climbed as the pressure rose. Under 18,000 in 1942, over 116,000 in 1943, more than 211,000 in 1944. A losing war still poured them out, because the design was made to be poured out. The gun's other gift was the quick-change barrel. Fire at 1,200 rounds a minute, and the barrel heats within seconds. The Meter's G42 let the crew release a hot barrel and drop in a fresh one in moments. That single feature is what let the fearsome rate of fire mean anything at all. Without it, the barrel would burn out and the gun would fall silent. With it, the crew could keep the saw running. Here, the famous rate of fire needs context. 1,200 rounds a minute is often told as pure advantage, as if faster were simply better. The evidence is more balanced. That speed devoured ammunition and cooked barrels. It demanded a crew feeding belts and swapping barrels constantly, and it demanded a supply chain to keep them fed. German gunners were trained to fire in short bursts precisely because the gun could empty a supply so fast. The speed was a weapon and a hunger at once. That is the trade-off the Meter's G42 wrote in steel. Its speed and cheapness bought suppression and numbers. They cost barrels, ammunition, and control. A crew paid in constant labor to keep the gun from destroying itself. The advantage was enormous. The bill was constant. The man who paid, on the American side, was the infantryman crossing open ground toward that sound. He could not maneuver against a wall of fire the way he could against a slower gun. He had to wait for artillery, for armor, for a flanking move, for the gun to change its barrel. The Meter's G42 did not need to be accurate. It needed only to be present. And it was present in the hundreds of thousands. American ordnance officers studied captured examples closely. By February 1943, they had published their first report on a captured Meter's G42. What they saw was not just a good machine gun. It was a manufacturing philosophy and a tactical doctrine welded together. Stamp the parts, feed the belt, change the barrel, move the gun between rolls. One weapon for the whole job. The Meter's G42 was the first German parent of the American gun. Its feed system, its belt, its whole idea of the general-purpose weapon would end up inside the Meter's 60. But a machine gun's feed is only half a machine gun. The other half is the action that drives it. And for that half, the story turns to a very different German weapon, built not for the man on the beach, but for the man falling out of the sky. Chapter 3. the rifle for men who fell from the sky. Crete taught the Germans a hard lesson. A paratrooper who lands carrying only a pistol is a paratrooper about to die. That lesson was paid for in 1941. German airborne troops seized the island of Crete, but the cost was severe, and part of the cost was the way they jumped. Under their doctrine, paratroopers dropped with pistols and grenades while their rifles and machine guns came down separately in containers. A man landed lightly armed and had to reach a weapons canister before he could fight. In the minutes between landing and finding that canister, he was nearly helpless. The German airborne arm belonged to the Luftwaffe, and the Luftwaffe's Reich Air Ministry drew the obvious conclusion. The paratrooper needed a weapon he could jump with and fight with immediately. Not a pistol, not a submachine gun with a pistol cartridge. A full-power rifle, in the standard 7.92 Mauser round, that a single man could use as a rifle, as a submachine gun, and as a light machine gun all at once. That requirement was extraordinary. It asked one weapon to replace three. It became the Fallschirmjägergewehr 42. The paratrooper rifle of 1942, known ever after as the FG-42. The winning design came from Louis Stange at Rheinmetall-Borsig. Production later moved in part to Heinrich Krieghoff's works, because the demands of the design strained manufacturing capacity. The gun that resulted was unlike anything else in the war. It was short, it fed from a magazine mounted on the left side, and it fired the full rifle cartridge from a compact frame that fought the recoil with an inline stock. Inside, it worked by a gas-operated rotating bolt. Gas tapped from the barrel drove a piston. The piston drove a bolt carrier. The bolt itself turned to lock and unlock, its lugs rotating into and out of the receiver. That rotating bolt principle traced back through earlier automatic weapons, and it was strong, compact, and well suited to a full-power round. It is the mechanism worth remembering, because it is the one that would survive. The FG-42 had a further refinement that showed how carefully it was thought out. It fired from a closed bolt in semi-automatic, for accuracy in the aimed single shot, and from an open bolt in full automatic, to help the barrel cool between bursts. One weapon, two firing behaviors, each tuned to its job. In its ambition, it was the airborne cousin of the general-purpose idea. Where the Meters G42 tried to be every machine gun, the FG42 tried to be every infantry weapon in one man's hands. Now the myth needs restraint. The FG42 is often remembered as a marvel, and mechanically it was. But it was not a battlefield success in any meaningful numerical sense. It was rare, and it was expensive. Sources place Krieghoff's output at roughly 2,000 rifles, and broader counts across the different models still land in the low thousands. Popular retellings sometimes push the total higher, toward figures like 7,000. That claim requires restraint. What the records reliably support is that the FG-42 was produced in the thousands, not the hundreds of thousands, and that material shortages strangled it. It was a brilliant answer, built in numbers too small to matter to the war. That is the trade-off the FG-42 wrote. It packed a squad's worth of firepower into one man's rifle. It paid in cost, in complexity, and in tiny production. The Meters G42 was cheap and everywhere. The FG42 was refined and almost nowhere. One German gun proved you could build in the millions. The other proved you could build a mechanism worth stealing. The man at the center of the FG42's story is the paratrooper it was built for. He stands in the door of a transport aircraft, and everything about his weapon is shaped by the fact that he is about to fall out of it. It must be short enough to jump with. It must be light enough to carry. It must fire the full rifle round so that when he lands, he is not outgunned. The whole design bends around a single body in a single moment of vulnerability. By 1945, both German guns lay open to the victors. The Meters G42, with its stamped construction and its belt feed and its quick-change barrel. The FG42, with its gas-operated rotating bolt and its compact strength. Each solved a piece of the problem that still sat unsolved in the American arsenal. Each had a part worth taking. The Americans took both. But they did not begin by combining them. They began the way the impatient always begin, by trying to copy the more famous of the two outright. That attempt would fail on the first shot, and the failure would teach the lesson that made everything after it possible. Chapter 4. The copy that fired once and stopped. The simplest way to get the buzzsaw was to copy the buzzsaw. America tried, and the copy failed on its first shot. The attempt began during the war itself, while the Meters G42 was still cutting down Allied troops. American ordnance wanted that weapon in American hands and in the American cartridge. The plan was direct. Take the Meters G42, reproduce it, and rechamber it from the German 7.92 Mauser to the American 30-06. The result was designated the T-24. The contract to build two prototypes went to the Saginaw Steering Gear Division of General Motors. Saginaw had already produced weapons during the war and had the tooling and the engineers. On paper, the task looked like translation, not invention. Copy the geometry, adjust the chamber, and issue an American buzzsaw. The engineers understood that the German gun's rate of fire was too high for American doctrine. 1,200 rounds a minute suited German training, but not the American way of fighting, and it burned through supply. So they set out to slow it down. They increased the weight of the bolt dramatically, from about 17 and 8/10 ounces to roughly 47 ounces, and stiffened the return spring. A heavier bolt moving against a stronger spring would cycle more slowly. That part of the thinking was sound. The failure was in a dimension nobody corrected. The American 30-06 cartridge is longer than the German 7.92 Mauser round by about a quarter of an inch. The Meters G42's receiver was built around the shorter German cartridge. To feed and cycle the longer American round, the receiver needed to be lengthened to match. It was not. The gun kept the German internal length and was asked to run a cartridge that did not fit the space. That quarter of an inch destroyed the project. At Aberdeen Proving Ground, across January and February of 1944, the T-24 was tested and it did not work. One prototype fired a single shot and failed to eject the spent case, twice over. The other suffered excessive ejection failures. Across the trial, the guns produced 51 malfunctions while firing a total of about 1,583 rounds. The cyclic rate that did register averaged only around 614 rounds a minute, far below the German original. In March 1944, the Army concluded that the T-24 functioned unsatisfactorily. Only the 2 prototypes were ever built. Here, the popular lesson is that copying a proven weapon is easy, a matter of tracing the drawings. The T-24 is the correction. Copying is not tracing. A machine gun is a system tuned to one cartridge in one space, and change the cartridge without changing the space, and the system stops. The Meters G42 was a superb design. The T-24 was that superb design broken by a quarter inch of brass. The failure was not German engineering. It was the assumption that you could lift a gun out of its cartridge and set it down in another. The trade-off in the T-24 was the trade-off of the shortcut itself. Copying whole promised speed, reproduce a finished weapon, and skip years of development. But the shortcut delivered a gun that could not chamber America's own ammunition, and the time saved was lost twice over in a program that produced nothing usable. The men who paid were the ordnance officers who now had a captured concept, a failed prototype, and no machine gun. But the T-24 was not wasted. Failure is information, and the information was precise. The problem was not the Meters G42's feed system, which was excellent. The problem was trying to carry that feed system on the Meters G42's own action, forced to swallow a cartridge it was never built around. The feed was worth keeping. The rest was worth discarding. That reframing changed the whole approach. If the Meters G42's belt feed was the treasure, then it did not need to ride on the Meters G42's action at all. It could be married to a different action, one already proven with a full-power rifle cartridge, one with room designed in from the start. The Americans had exactly such an action in their hands. They had it in the second German gun, the paratrooper rifle with the gas-operated rotating bolt. So the next attempt would not copy one weapon. It would take the feed from one German gun and the action from another and fuse them. The idea was almost surgical. Remove the best organ from each donor and build a new body around the transplant. That is where the Meters 60 truly begins, not on a drawing board, and not with a clean American design. It begins with a captured paratrooper rifle about to be cut in half on a workbench in Philadelphia. Chapter 5. 2 enemies, bolted into one gun. The American machine gun did not begin with a blueprint. It began with a captured FG-42 sawn apart and the top cover of Ann Meters G42. The work happened at the Bridge Tool and Die Works in Philadelphia. In 1946, with the war over and the captured German weapons available for study, Bridge Tool and Die took an FG-42 and rebuilt it into something new. They kept the FG-42's operating mechanism, its gas system and rotating bolt, the action that already handled a full rifle cartridge. Onto that action, they grafted the belt feed of the Meters G42, working from the German gun's top cover feed design. The project ran roughly 6 months. The result was the T-44. The T-44 was a hybrid in the most literal sense. It was one German gun's action wearing another German gun's feed. The FG-42 gave it the rotating bolt and the gas-driven cycle. The Meters G42 gave it the belt and the feed mechanism that pulled that belt across the gun. Where the T-24 had tried to make one German weapon do everything and failed, the T-44 split the labor between two and worked. That first hybrid was still rough. It was chambered in the 30-06, and it used an awkward vertical arrangement to feed the belt, a legacy of adapting parts that were never meant to sit together. It was a proof of concept more than a soldier's weapon. But the concept was proven. The graft held. The action drove the feed served the action, and the gun cycled. Then the cartridge changed, and the design matured around the change. In the years after the war, the Western Allies moved toward a new standard rifle cartridge, the round that would become the 7.62 by 51mm NATO, then known by its development name as the T-65. It was shorter than the old 30-06, but nearly as powerful. American machine gun development pivoted to the new round. The hybrid was rechambered for it and redesigned with a more conventional horizontal belt feed. That version was the T-52. From the T-52, the design walked through a series of refinements, each shedding another piece of its improvised past. Wooden furniture gave way to plastic. The layout was cleaned up. The designation moved to the T-161 series, and within that series, the changes continued through the T-161E1, the E2, and the E3, tracking the final settling of the NATO cartridge and the fixes the trials demanded. The Inland Division of General Motors built the prototype that would be adopted. In August 1956, an Army board recommended the design for adoption. On the 30th of January, 1957, the T-161E3 received type classification. It became the M60. Notice what the record actually shows here, because the myth runs the other way. The M60 is often described as a clean-sheet American machine gun, a homegrown design that simply happened to arrive after the war. It was not. It was a deliberate, traceable hybrid of two captured German weapons, refined over a decade until the seams no longer showed. The myth felt true because by 1957 the gun looked American, fired an American-led NATO cartridge, and carried an American designation. Underneath the paint, its heart was the FG-42, and its feed was the Meters G-42. The trade-off in this approach was the trade-off of borrowing. Taking two proven mechanisms saved years. The Americans did not have to invent a reliable, full-power action or a working belt feed from nothing, because the Germans had already built both. That was the advantage, and it was large. The cost was that the M60 inherited another army's engineering choices, and with them, another army's compromises. Design decisions made for a 1942 paratrooper rifle and a 1942 stamped machine gun now lived inside a 1957 American weapon. Some of those inherited choices would not reveal their price until the gun reached a jungle. The men who paid, in the near term, were the engineers at Bridge Tool and Die and the arsenals that followed them, who had to reinforce a decade-old paratrooper rifle to survive the pounding of continuous belt-fed fire. An FG-42 was built to fire from a magazine in bursts. The M60 would be asked to run belts of hundreds of rounds. The action had to be strengthened for a workload it was never born to carry. By early 1957, the United States finally had what it had lacked since 1945. One weapon that could follow the squad on a bipod and hold a line from a tripod. A general-purpose machine gun of its own, at last, even if its parentage lay across the old front line. What the drawings could not show was how the thing actually behaved when the trigger went back. To understand what America had truly built, it helps to follow a single round from the belt to the brass on the ground. Chapter 6. One trigger pull, from belt to brass. The M60 fires from an open bolt. Every stage of that firing cycle carries a German fingerprint. The gun is a conversation between two dead designs. Start before the shot. When the gunner is ready, the bolt is held to the rear, back against its spring, sear engaged. Firing from an open bolt is deliberate. It leaves the chamber empty and open between bursts, so air moves through and heat escapes, and there is no live round sitting in a hot chamber waiting to cook off. The Meters G-42 fired from an open bolt. The FG-42 fired from an open bolt in full automatic. The M60 inherited the logic from both. A belt of linked cartridges lies across the feed tray, held by the Meters 13 disintegrating link. Each link grips one round and lets go as the round is stripped away, so the belt falls apart into loose links as the gun eats it. The cover that holds the feed mechanism and the pawls that drag the belt across with each cycle descend from the Meters G-42. This is the treasure the T-24 failure had identified. The German feed, kept, transplanted, and set to work. The gunner presses the trigger. The sear releases the bolt. The compressed spring drives the whole bolt assembly forward. As it runs forward, the bolt strips the first round from its link and pushes it out of the belt and into the chamber. The rotating bolt reaches the breech and turns. Its locking lugs rotate into their recesses, and the bolt locks the cartridge in place behind the barrel. That rotating bolt is the heart of the FG-42's action, carried whole into the American gun. The firing pin follows through and strikes the primer. The cartridge fires. Now the gun must harvest its own energy to run the next round, and here sits the M60's most distinctive organ, the gas system. As the bullet travels down the barrel, it passes a small port. A portion of the high-pressure gas behind it bleeds through that port into a gas cylinder and pushes against a piston. The M60's gas system used an expansion and cutoff principle. Gas entered and drove the piston back, and as the piston moved, the passages that admitted the gas moved out of alignment and cut the supply off. A measured pulse of gas did the work, then stopped. The design aimed to make the operating force smooth and even rather than a single violent hammer blow, and to keep excess pressure from battering the moving parts, with surplus pressure bled away. It was a thoughtful system meant to protect the gun from its own energy. The piston drives the operating rod rearward. The rod pulls the bolt back. As the bolt travels rearward, it rotates the other way, its lugs turning out of their recesses, unlocking. The extractor holds the spent case against the bolt face and drags it out of the chamber. The ejector flings it clear, and the empty brass spins away from the gun. The bolt continues back, compressing the spring, and on its way it works the feed mechanism, which drags the belt across and presents the next round. If the trigger is still held, the sear does not catch, and the bolt runs forward again to repeat everything. Strip, chamber, lock, fire, unlock, extract, eject, feed. Around 550 times a minute the cycle turns, brass arcing out one side while the belt is dragged in the other, links falling away below. That is the whole gun in one sentence of motion. Now the myth this system attracts. The gas arrangement is sometimes described as self-regulating, and people hear in that word a promise that the gun somehow managed its own reliability. It did not. Self-regulating meant it metered its own gas pulse and smoothed its own operating force. It said nothing about fouling, dirt, or wear. A gun can regulate the force of its stroke and still choke on carbon and grit. The word described the physics of one pulse of gas, not the health of the weapon. And here the trade-off inside the mechanism shows itself, quietly, in a way that would grow loud later. The expansion and cutoff gas system reduced the hammering that a cruder system would inflict, and that was a real advantage in the life of the parts. But the system was made of several small components that had to be assembled in the correct order and orientation. Put them together wrong, and the gas would not cut off as intended. The gun could then run without stopping, a runaway that fired until the belt was empty or the gunner broke the belt by force. An advantage in smoothness was paid for in a system that punished a careless hand in the dark. That vulnerability was invisible on a proving ground, where trained technicians assembled the gun correctly every time. It would become visible only when the weapon was in the hands of tired men, cleaning it in the field, reassembling it by feel. A mechanism is only a promise until a factory makes thousands of it and hands the finished weight to one man's shoulders. The M60 was about to be made in quantity, and the men who would carry it were about to learn every one of its inherited habits. Chapter 7. The Factories, and the weight they handed the man who carried it. Ordnance had a design. Now it needed the gun in every squad. What arrived weighed 23 pounds and ate ammunition like nothing the infantry had carried before. The M60 moved into production in the late 1950s and into service around 1959 and 1960, making it fell to a set of American manufacturers whose names sit behind the weapon's whole career. Bridge, Tool, and Die had built the first hybrid. The Inland Division of General Motors built the adopted prototype. Over the production life, the principal makers included Sacco Defense in Maine and the Merrimont Corporation, also in Maine, which produced the gun in quantity and later a lightweight variant of its own. The M60 became the standard general-purpose machine gun across the American services. What the factories delivered was heavy. The gun weighed about 23 pounds, empty, before a single belt was loaded or a spare barrel was slung. That is the number that shaped everything about how it was carried and how it was felt. It was still lighter than what it partly replaced. The old tripod-bound and bipod versions of the Browning were heavier in their sustained fire forms, and the M60 undercut the heaviest by around 10 pounds. But 10 pounds saved on paper is still 23 pounds on a man's shoulders through heat and mud. And the weight was only the gun. The M60 fed from belts of 7.62 NATO, and it consumed them fast. In sustained combat use, gunners were trained to fire in controlled bursts, around 6 to 9 rounds at a time, with a few seconds between them, which worked out to roughly 100 rounds a minute. That was the disciplined rate. It kept the barrel alive and the ammunition lasting. Even disciplined, 100 rounds a minute is a river of brass, and every round of it had to be carried into the fight on somebody's back. That is how the gun earned its name. Soldiers called the M60 the pig. The nickname came from the weight and from the appetite together. It was heavy to hump and it was hungry to feed, and the two traits made it a burden shared across the men around it. A hog to carry, hungry for ammunition, and, when the shooting started, the most important thing in the squad. The gun was never a one-man weapon in practice. It took a team. The gunner carried and fired the M60. An assistant gunner carried a spare barrel and cans of linked ammunition, helped feed the belt, watched for stoppages, and cleared them. Often a third man, an ammunition bearer, carried still more belts. The firepower of one pig rested on the backs of 2 or 3 men, and the belts were shared out among them, draped across chests and shoulders and stuffed into cans. Here the nickname invites a small correction. The pig sounds like pure complaint, and outsiders often read it as contempt. Among the men who carried it, the word was closer to rough affection. A soldier can curse a weight all day on the march and still be desperately glad of it when the enemy opens fire. The men who called it a hog to carry were often the same men who said, in the next breath, that you were damned happy to have it when the shooting started. The name held both feelings at once. The trade-off the pig handed the infantry was blunt and physical. Full 7.62 power fed from a belt gave a squad genuine machine gun fire for the first time in a portable, maneuverable weapon. That was the advantage the Army had chased since 1945, finally in hand. The cost was paid in a man's back and in a platoon's logistics. Somebody carried 23 pounds of gun. Somebody carried the spare barrel. Several men carried the ammunition that 100 rounds a minute demanded. The gun gave the squad its firepower, and the squad gave the gun its legs. Consider the gunner on the move under that load. The M60 hangs from a sling across his body. A belt lies over his shoulders or across his chest, the links cold against him at the start of the day and warm by afternoon. His assistant walks near, weighed down with the spare barrel and the cans. The two of them are a system, and the system is slow. And the system is exactly what the rest of the squad will scream for the moment a firefight opens. Every ounce of that burden is the price of the fire it can produce. The factories had solved the problem the Army set them. They had put a general-purpose machine gun into the hands of every squad, in quantity, in the national cartridge, at a weight a man could carry, if not enjoy. What the factories could not do was test the gun the way war would test it. The proving grounds were dry and controlled. The place the M60 was about to go was neither. It was a country of paddies and triple canopy jungle and heat that rotted equipment, and it would find every habit the gun had inherited from its German parents. Chapter 8. The Pig Goes to Vietnam. In Vietnam, the M60 stopped being a support weapon and became the center of the fight. When contact broke, the call down the line was always the same. The gun had entered service in peacetime, but Vietnam was where it was proven in the hands of ordinary infantry, day after day, in the worst conditions a machine gun can face. American ground forces arrived in strength through the middle of the 1960s, and the M60 came with them. It rode on patrols, sat in defensive positions, hung in the doorways of helicopters, and walked point in places where a firefight could begin at a range of a few meters with no warning at all. In that kind of fighting, the M60 became the weapon that decided the first minutes. Riflemen carried the M16, and the M16 fired a light, fast round. The M60 fired the full 7.62, and the difference in effect was obvious to everyone present. The heavier round carried farther, hit harder, tore through cover, the lighter round would not, and put down a volume of fire no rifleman could match. When a patrol was ambushed, the gun was what answered the ambush. So the cry, again and again in the accounts of the men who were there, was for the gun to come forward. 60 up front. When the shooting started, the M60 was wanted at the point of contact, because the M60 was what could seize the initiative back from an enemy who had chosen the moment. The gunner, who a minute earlier had been cursing the weight, was now the man everyone was shouting for. The gun was used with discipline when discipline was possible. Gunners fired in bursts, 6 to 9 rounds, a few seconds apart, holding to roughly 100 rounds a minute in sustained fire. That rhythm kept the barrel from cooking and the ammunition from vanishing in one long pull. It also kept the fire accurate, because a controlled burst goes where it is aimed, and a long one climbs and wanders. The best gunners were the ones who could feel that rhythm under fire and hold to it while everything told them to hold the trigger down. The M60 could also be fired on the move, from the hip and the shoulder, walking. In assault fire, a gunner advanced and fired, raking a tree line or a bunker to keep the enemy's heads down while his squad moved. It was not precise. It was suppression by presence. The same job the Meters G42 had done from the far side of the beach a war earlier, now done by the American descendant walking forward. The record holds a specific act that shows the gun at its extreme. In 1966, Lance Corporal Richard Pittman of the Marine Corps took up an M60 during an action against a much larger enemy force, moving forward toward elements identified with a North Vietnamese Army division, and put down fire that let him hold against numbers that should have overwhelmed him. He received the Medal of Honor. The citation is his, earned by his conduct. But the tool in his hands was the pig, and what it could do in the first minutes of a fight is exactly why men called for it. Here, a popular claim needs restraint. It was often said of the M60, and said with pride, that it could huff and puff and blow down houses. The image captures something real. The 7.62 round hit hard, and the volume was heavy, and against light structures it did serious work. But the phrase is a soldier's hyperbole, not a ballistic fact, and it should be read as one. What the evidence supports is that the M60's fire was decisively heavier than the rifleman's, heavy enough to dominate a firefight and punch through cover the M16 could not. That is impressive enough without the house coming down. The trade-off Vietnam exposed was written into the gunner himself. The gun's firepower made him the most valuable man in the firefight. That same firepower made him the first target. The enemy knew the sound of the M60 as well as the Americans did, and they knew that killing the gun blinded the squad. The advantage of being the man everyone shouted for was that everyone shouted for you. The cost was that the enemy was listening. The jungle did more than test the gunner's nerve and the gun's firepower. It tested the metal, the assembly, and every inherited habit the M60 carried out of two German designs. Heat, mud, water, and hard use in the hands of exhausted men found the weak points the proving grounds had never touched. The pig would keep fighting. But it would keep fighting while its crews improvised fixes for problems the designers had left them, using wire, tin cans, and whatever the field provided. Chapter 9. The flaws the jungle found. The M60 worked until it was dirty, hot, or handled in a hurry. Vietnam supplied all three at once, and often together. Start with the barrel. Fire a machine gun long enough and the barrel glows and must be changed, and the M60, like its German parents, was built to change barrels. But somewhere in the design, nobody gave the barrel a carrying handle. The Meter's G42 that donated the feed had a barrel a crew could swap by a handle and a quick motion. The M60's barrel had no such handle of its own. To change it, the crew was issued an asbestos mitt, an oven glove, to grasp the red-hot steel. That solution failed the moment it met reality. In a firefight, a gunner fumbling for an asbestos mitt to wrestle a glowing barrel off his gun is a gunner not firing, and the mitt was easily lost, dropped, or simply not to hand when the barrel needed changing right now. The men getting their mittens on, as one dry account put it, did not work out well in combat. A feature the German gun had solved cleanly, the quick barrel change, had been re-imported in a form that was awkward exactly when it mattered most. There was more the barrel carried. On the early M60, the bipod and the gas cylinder were attached to the barrel itself. That meant a spare barrel was not just a tube of steel. Each spare barrel came with its own bipod and its own gas system, which added weight and expense to every replacement the assistant gunner humped. The front sight, too, lived forward on the gun in a way that tied zero to the barrel assembly. Changing barrels meant changing more than the barrel. The inherited layout had bundled too much onto the one part that was meant to be swapped fast. Then the gas system, the clever expansion and cut-off design from the last chapter, revealed its field cost. The nut that retained the gas assembly could work itself loose under the vibration of sustained fire and back out, and if it fell off, the gun was down. Crews learned to secure it with wire from a coat hanger, a field fix passed gunner to gunner. The same gas system's small parts, if reassembled in the wrong order during cleaning, could produce a runaway gun that fired until the belt was gone. A system designed to protect the gun from its own energy had handed tired men a puzzle they had to solve correctly in the dark. The feed had its own field remedy. Belts could bind as they were dragged into the gun, and a bound belt is a stoppage. Gunners found that wiring an empty C ration can to the left side of the receiver, just below the feedway, gave the belt a smooth path and kept it flowing without snagging. It was scrap tin, solving a feed problem, and it worked well enough that it spread across the force. A ration can and a coat hanger became, in effect, unofficial parts of the weapon. There were extraction troubles as well. Spent cases could fail to extract. Rims could tear as the extractor pulled, and a gunner might have to ram a cleaning rod down the bore to knock a stuck case free. The barrel latch could catch on the gunner's own gear and unlatch at the wrong moment. The grip housing was held by a spring clip that could break. None of these was catastrophic alone. Together, they meant the M60 demanded attention, care, and a bag of field wisdom to keep running. Here, fairness demands the judge's restraint, because a jam is rarely the simple thing it looks like. When a M60 stopped, the cause might lie in the links of the belt, in a bad round of ammunition, in too much lubricant or too little, in dirt and grit, in worn or damaged parts, or in maintenance not done or done wrong. The gun's inherited design set some of these traps, but the jungle set others, and an exhausted crew set still others, and the honest verdict is that a stoppage was usually several failures meeting at once. The design deserves its share of blame, and no more than its share. The trade-off running through all of it was consistent. Every field fix that kept the gun alive was also a confession of what the factory had gotten wrong. The C ration kept the belt flowing and advertised a feed that could bind. The coat hanger wire held the gas nut and advertised a nut that backed out. The asbestos mitt changed the barrel and advertised a barrel with no handle. The men made the pig work. In making it work, they left a record of its faults written in scrap. None of it killed the M60. The gun kept fighting through the whole war and long after, precisely because its crews were resourceful enough to patch what the designers had left open. But the faults were real, they were documented, and they started an argument inside the American military that would run for 30 years. That argument was carried on not in words but in variants, each one an attempt to answer a complaint the jungle had filed. Chapter 10. The gun that grew a family. A weapon issued this widely is never finished. The M60 spent decades being lightened, rehung, and rehung again, each change chasing a complaint. The first branches of the family grew not on the ground but in the air. Helicopters needed guns in their doorways, and the M60 was adapted for the role. The M60D was a pintle-mounted version, Fitted with spade grips and ring-type sights for a door gunner firing from a moving aircraft, its bipod removed because a mount held it now. The M60C was a fixed, aircraft-mounted version fired by the aircraft's electrical and hydraulic controls rather than by hand, built in the order of several hundred. The M60B served in helicopters as well, in a lighter handheld door configuration. The same core gun, redressed for the sky. On the ground, the improvement programs began attacking the faults directly. The M60E1 gathered a set of fixes but did not enter full production. The M60E2 was a vehicle weapon, mounted coaxially and fired electrically, with an extended gas system to route its gases out of the crew compartment. Each variant took the same action and feed and bent them toward a particular job, the general-purpose idea spreading into a dozen specific purposes. The most important ground revision addressed the barrel burden. Recall the early gun's worst inherited habit? The bipod and gas cylinder hung on the barrel, so that every spare barrel carried its own bipod, gas system, and the weight and cost that came with them. In the 1980s, the M60E3 finally cut that knot. The bipod was moved off the barrel and onto the front handguard of the gun, where it belonged. Now a spare barrel could be a barrel. The E3 also added a forward grip and shed weight overall, coming in around 5 pounds lighter than the original, near 18 or 19 pounds depending on configuration. It was the pig, put on a diet and replumbed. But the diet had a price, and here a tempting assumption needs correcting. It is natural to think lighter is simply better, that every pound cut is a pound of pure gain. The M60E3 shows the cost hiding under the weight saving. Thinning the gun to make it lighter reduced its durability. Lightened components wore faster and were less tolerant of the sustained fire a machine gun exists to deliver. The E3 was easier to carry and quicker to handle, and it gave up some of the endurance that was the whole point of a belt-fed weapon. The pounds came off the man's back and came out of the gun's service life. That trade-off drove the next branches. The M60E4, known in naval service as the Mark 43, reworked the design again for better reliability and added rail configurations for optics and accessories, finding a home with naval and special operations users who valued its lighter weight compared with the alternatives. Later still came the M60E6, the most refined of the line, lighter again at around 20.5 pounds, and built to survive. In torture testing, the M60E6 was reported to run a 50,000-round trial at a mean rounds between stoppages far beyond the old guns, with the receiver life pushed past 100,000 rounds. The design that began as 2 German organs stitched together had been engineered, decade by decade, into something genuinely durable. Follow one man through this family and the point becomes clear. The Vietnam gunner cursed a barrel with no handle and a bipod that made every spare barrel a burden. The 1980s gunner, handed in M60E3, found the bipod on the handguard and the gun 5 pounds lighter and thought it a real improvement, until the lighter parts wore and reminded him that a machine gun pays for every ounce it sheds. The modern user of an M60E6 got much of the lightness without the fragility, but only after decades of engineers chasing the balance across a dozen variants. The trade-off across the whole family was one long negotiation between weight and life. Move the bipod off the barrel, and the barrel change gets simpler while nothing is lost. That fix was pure gain, the correction of a plain mistake. But thin the gun to cut pounds, and durability follows the weight down. That fix was a bargain, gain paid for in wear. The family tree of the M60 is a record of the military learning, slowly, which of the gun's faults were errors to be erased and which were costs to be balanced. While America argued over ounces and barrel life at home, the M60 was already doing something the improvement programs never planned. It was leaving. Surplus guns, military aid, foreign purchases, and the sheer number produced were carrying the pig far beyond the American squad it had been built for, into other armies, onto movie screens, and eventually into the hands of civilian collectors who would pay a small fortune to own one. Chapter 11. The Pig Abroad and the Pig on Screen. The M60 outlived its American frontline career by going everywhere else. It went into foreign armories, onto movie screens, and into civilian vaults. The foreign career came first and ran widest. The M60 was fielded by a long list of nations, more than 30 over its life, spread across every continent. Australia carried it. So did South Korea, Taiwan, Israel, Greece, Turkey, the Philippines, and many more, from Latin America through the Middle East to Southeast Asia. Some received it through American military aid, some bought it, some inherited it from the tide of surplus that followed decades of American production. A gun made in Maine ended up holding lines and guarding borders in countries its designers never considered. That spread is the real afterlife of most successful weapons, and it is quieter than the combat record, but longer. A rifle or a machine gun that serves one nation for a few decades can serve a dozen others for many more, passed down and passed along as newer designs push it out of the front rank at home. The M60, adopted in 1957 and serving the United States for roughly half a century, seeded armories around the world that would run it for years after America had begun to set it aside. Then there was the screen, where the M60 became something no proving ground could make it. In the film First Blood and the Rambo pictures that followed, the M60 became the signature weapon of a lone hero. Fired one-handed from the hip, belts of ammunition draped across a bare chest. The image burned itself into popular culture. For millions of people who would never see a real one, the M60 simply was what a machine gun looked like, and the way to fire it was to hold it in one hand and walk forward. That image deserves the channel's restraint, because it is cinema, not doctrine. A real M60 fired one-handed from the hip by a single man is not a weapon being used well. It is a weapon being used for a camera. In service, the gun was fired from a bipod, a tripod, or a mount, in controlled bursts, by a crew, aimed. The heroic one-handed hip fire that defined the M60 in the public mind was the opposite of how the men who depended on it actually kept it accurate and kept it fed. The movie made the gun immortal and, in the same frame, misremembered it. The third afterlife was the collectors. In the United States, transferable machine guns are tightly restricted and their supply is frozen. And that scarcity drives prices to heights that have nothing to do with the gun's original cost. A legally transferable M60 could command well past $40,000. And certain configurations ran higher still, into the tens of thousands, towards $65,000 for some. A gun that a factory once turned out for the government at a modest price became, decades later, a five-figure prize, valued not for what it could do, but for how few could ever be legally owned. And the design itself refused to die commercially. After 2000, the firm U.S. Ordnance took up the M60, modernizing it and producing improved variants, including the M60E6. The old hybrid found new buyers. Denmark, notably, ordered the M60E6 in quantity from around 2015, several hundred guns, choosing a modernized version of a 1957 design over newer competitors for its balance of weight and performance. The gun America had stitched from two German weapons was still being manufactured and still being adopted, in the 21st century, by a NATO ally. The trade-off in this afterlife was subtle. Becoming an icon kept the M60's name alive far beyond its frontline usefulness, and that fame carried the design forward, into foreign sales and civilian legend and modern remanufacture. But the fame also buried the engineering. The public remembered Rambo's prop, not the expansion cutoff gas system or the FG-42 bolt or the Meter's G-42 feed. The gun became a silhouette, an idea, a symbol, and the actual weapon, with its real virtues and its real inherited faults, disappeared behind the image. Immortality came at the cost of being understood. Behind the legend, the professional verdict was being written in a different place, on a range where two machine guns were tested head-to-head. The gun America had copied out of the enemy's parts was about to be measured against another descendant of the same German buzzsaw, and this time the American hybrid would lose the job it had held for a generation. Chapter 12. The verdict. Copied, then surpassed. The M60 proved a requirement more than it proved a design. It showed that America needed a general-purpose machine gun, then lost the job to a better one. The reckoning came in trials in the middle of the 1990s. The American military tested an enhanced M60 against a competitor, the M240, in a direct comparison of reliability, and the numbers were not close. The M240 ran a mean of 2,962 rounds between stoppages and thousands between failures. The enhanced M60 managed a mean of 846 rounds between stoppages. On the measure that matters most to a machine gun, keeping running, the M240 outlasted the M60 by a wide margin. The M240B was adopted as the Army's general-purpose machine gun, and the pig began leaving the front line for good. There is a deep irony in the gun that won. The M240 is the FN mag, a Belgian design, and the FN mag is itself descended from the same German ancestry as the M60. Its feed mechanism traces to the Meter's G-42, the very buzzsaw whose feed America had transplanted into the M60. Its action drew on the proven Browning automatic rifle lineage. The mag was, in its own way, another child of the wartime lessons, engineered from the start as a single coherent weapon rather than grafted together from captured organs after the fact. And the sharpest turn in the whole story sits in the dates. When the American general-purpose machine gun was chosen in the 1950s, the M60's design had been selected over foreign competitors that included the Belgian Fen mag. America had the mag available and picked its own hybrid instead. Roughly 50 years later, in the reliability trials, the choice reversed. The gun that had been passed over in the 1950s returned to take the job the M60 had held for a generation. The verdict of half a century was that the design America declined the first time had been the more durable answer all along. Now the myth that must be corrected is the harshest one, the idea that the M60 failed. It did not fail. A weapon that serves as a nation's standard machine gun for roughly 50 years, arms more than 30 other nations, fights through a major war and many smaller ones, and is still being manufactured and adopted in the 21st century, has not failed by any honest measure. It was surpassed. Being beaten by a better design after 50 years of service is not the record of a failure. It is the record of a weapon that did its job long enough for its replacement to be worth building. What the M60 truly proved was the requirement itself. In 1945, American doctrine did not fully believe in the general-purpose machine gun. The M60 put one in every squad and let a generation of soldiers discover what it was worth, in Vietnam and after, in the paddies and the doorways and the defensive lines. By the time the M240 won the trials, no one questioned whether America needed a general-purpose machine gun. The M60 had settled that question by existing. The M240 only answered it better. The trade-off of the M60's whole life sits in that sequence. Choosing the home-built hybrid in 1957 got a general-purpose machine gun into American hands quickly, in the national cartridge, with an American name, built by American factories. That was the advantage, and it was worth having. The cost was that the compromises stitched into the gun from two aging German designs postponed the reckoning. The better answer, the MAG, waited 50 years for its second chance, and then took the job. America got its machine gun sooner by building the M60, and got its best machine gun later by finally adopting the design it had first refused. Picture the armorer at the end of it, retiring a pig and issuing a MAG in its place. He is handing a soldier a gun that is, in its bones, a cousin of the one he is taking away, both of them descended from the same wartime German engineering, one grafted together in a hurry after the war and one refined into a single, coherent whole. The lineage that runs through his hands is the whole story in miniature. The buzzsaw that terrified American infantry on the beaches went on to father the machine guns that armed their grandsons. America finished the Second World War without one machine gun that fit the squad. The bar could move but ran dry. The Browning could sustain but could not maneuver. Between them sat a gap the Germans had already filled. The gun that showed America what it lacked was the Meters G42, the buzzsaw, cheap and stamped and everywhere, its feed and its general-purpose idea worth stealing. The mechanism worth stealing came from a second German gun, the FG42, the paratrooper rifle with its gas-operated rotating bolt. America first tried to copy the buzzsaw outright, in the T-24, and a quarter-inch of cartridge stopped the copy on its first shot. So Bridge, Tool, and Die took the FG42's action and the Meters G42's feed and grafted them into the T-44, and a decade of refinement turned that graft into the M60. The gun that resulted carried both German fingerprints through every firing cycle, open bolt to falling brass. The factories built it heavy, 23 pounds, and hungry for belts, and the men who carried it named it the Pig, half curse and half love. In Vietnam, it became the weapon everyone shouted for, 60 up front, and the jungle found every inherited fault, patched with coat hanger wire and C-ration cans and an asbestos mitt for a barrel with no handle. Then came the family of variants, lighter and lighter, learning which faults were errors and which were costs. Then the foreign armories, 30 nations and more. Then the movie screen that made it immortal and misremembered it. And then, after 50 years, the Meters 240, a cousin of the same buzzsaw, took the job the Meters 60 had held. So the question the story asked at the start can be answered. How do you build a weapon of your own out of the guns your enemy built first? You admit the enemy solved the problem before you did. You take the best organ from each of his designs and graft them into a body that fires your cartridge and wears your name. You get a machine gun into your soldier's hands years sooner than you could have alone. And then you spend the next half-century paying the interest on that loan, in field fixes and failed trials and the slow discovery that the design you refused was the one you should have taken. America set out to build a machine gun of its own. It fielded the enemies and called it the Meters 60.